Hey guys, this tutorial is going to be focusing on all the different variable types in FlowCanvas, what they are, and how to use them. After adding a FlowScript controller to an object, you'll see that you have these Blackboard variables, and you have this Blackboard script. If I delete that script, it deletes the object Blackboard. I can add one back, Blackboard, and make sure I drag it into the Blackboard swatch there, and it comes back. The main difference between the object Blackboard and the graph Blackboard is that the graph Blackboard can only have its variables modified by clicking Edit FlowScript. So let's add some examples. So we have a Boolean there, and let's add an integer here. Okay, so here you can see, put away the FlowScript. When I press the square here, I can see the integer, but I cannot see the Boolean. If I click Edit FlowScript, I can now see the Boolean here. And so generally, when you want your variable to be modified from outside, I would add it to the object Blackboard. There are more nuances, but in this tutorial, we're going to keep it basic and look at bound graphs in the scene. So you can add variables just like that, choosing a type, and you can remove them just like this by deleting that variable. Okay, so let's make a variable in our object Blackboard. We're going to make a speed variable. So let's say float, let's say speed, or units per second to be more accurate. All right, and what we want to do is we want to move this square we have left or right at the rate of what the speed is. Let's just make it 3 for now. So press space. I'm going to find a keyboard key like this. Left arrow. Control D, duplicate. Right arrow. Good. And I want to translate it. So I'm going to grab that. The transform. And I'm going to call translate. And we're going to use the float. All right. There we go. So that is nice on the positive. Oh, that should be negative. On the negative one. And here, zoom in a bit. Here for the positive. There we go. Now, what I want to do is I want to actually multiply this direction by our units per second. And so to do that, we're just going to get our units per second, and we're going to drag it out, look for a multiply. We're going to use float multiply. And then here, you see -1. And here, +1. And of course, to make it smooth, we need to multiply this also by the delta time. So let's just search for delta time. There it is. So I'm going to copy paste that, multiply this, connect that, and multiply that by delta time like this. And copy all of this. Okay. This is not ideal actually, because we are copying so much stuff. But first, let's just see how this works. I'm going to hide the Blackboard variables just by clicking there. Okay, so you see it works nicely. The behavior works. However, it's not really ideal that we are copy pasting everything here, right? So let's go back into the graph, and what you can actually do is you can hook this up like that. So now we're only referencing that units per second once, and same with our delta time like that. Okay. Now let's make another behavior what we're going to do is we're going to make it so that when we press up, we're going to increase the speed, and when we press down, we're going to decrease the speed. So to do this, we will grab our units per second, and instead of get, we're going to use set, like this. So when down, our units per second is going to be, and we can choose an operation here. In this case, we're going to add. We're going to add, let's say 3. And when we press down, we're going to subtract 3. Like that. And let's see how this goes. So we can keep an eye on our variable here. We can also see it here. So right now it's 3. I press up, now it's 6. Now it's 9, 12, and it gets faster and faster, and it goes down. So that's pretty straightforward, and that's how our Blackboard variables work. So the next thing I want to do is I want to actually show you how constant variables work. So here, it's not really ideal that we have to zoom in so far in order to see what these values are. -1, +1, or 3 and -3. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to drag out from here and create a constant variable, make a constant variable. And you see now it's much bigger, much more readable. So this is what I generally recommend using constant variables for, making sure that you can read your graphs as cleanly as possible. So let's look at these as well. And drag it out, make it constant, make this constant. Perfect. Now, one cool thing is that this node and this node is actually the same node, and they can go back and forth from a constant to a linked variable. So here, for example, let's say I wanted to create this as a variable so I can modify it. I will click this little circle here, then click this graph, create new. Well, actually, I'm going to do square, create new. Just like that. And we're going to call this our speed decrease and make that -3. And I can turn that back to a constant by clicking that and setting its value there. There we go. So it's very easy to refactor your graph by using this. Okay, so next, what I want to show you is how to use a flow parameter. So actually, this is not really that clean. We're doing a lot of kind of copied logic here and there. You see here we have 2 of these translate nodes, and for example, if I wanted the character to face the direction or something, I'd have to make sure I go through all this logic, and I end up having a lot of copy paste, which is not very scale friendly. So what we can actually do instead is let's refactor this, and to make it clean, let's just start from the beginning. So we have a left arrow and a right arrow, so Control D, duplicate. And the first thing I want to do is I want to calculate which direction. And that is going to be controlled by whether it's the left arrow or the right arrow that we have pressed. And we're going to use flow parameters for this. So let's write a flow parameter, integer, copy, paste, or Control D, same thing. Okay. So now when this is pressed, we're going to write a flow parameter, and using what we've already learnt, we're going to create a constant so that we can connect that very nicely there. And that's going to be called the direction. Now this flow parameter only exists each flow that happens. Once this goes through again, this is reset to its default value. Okay, so when we press the left arrow, we want it to be set to -1. And when we press the right arrow, we want it to be set to +1. Okay, and now we can do read flow parameter. And now we can converge these in here nicely and use our constant name, our identifier for our flow parameter. And now we have our integer here. So let's create our translate, copy, paste. And now we want to multiply it by our delta time, and we want to multiply it by our units per second. So we'll copy paste these. And let's create some multiply, make sure they are float multiplies. Copy paste, copy paste. So first we're going to multiply our direction by our units per second. Then we're going to multiply our time.delta time times the result of that. That goes into here. Move these guys down, bring that over, connect that up, and there we go. Now we have more linear flow through, right? And if we wanted to reuse that parameter, we can read it here as well. We could also drag it out from here, but for cleanliness, we can also just do it like this. There we go. So now we could use that to change the direction or something like that. All right, and let's just see that going. So let's delete the old one. There we go. Holding the right arrow down, holding the left arrow down, and changing the speed. So that's how our flow parameters work. All right, so the next thing I want to do is I want to implement a score in this little game. Now, in order to do this with FlowCanvas, it's actually really straightforward and really intuitive. You can create what's called a global blackboard. So let me create a game object here. Create a global blackboard. Global blackboard. Okay. And I'll add a variable, and this is going to be an integer, score. That's going to start at 0. So in any flow in this scene, I can actually access that variable. And it's very easy. I can actually just search in here for score, and it's right there. I could also, if I wasn't sure what my global Blackboard variables were, I could go into variables, Blackboard, global Blackboard, and they're right there. So what I want to do is when I press space key, I want to increment that score. So let's say set score, and we're going to add, and we're just going to add 1 when it's down, so it only happens once. Okay, so let's play. And I can see here our global Blackboard, which has been added to the don't destroy on load, which is this little setting here, is keeping track of our score. But I actually want to show that score somewhere on the screen. So to do that, I'm going to create a text mesh inside a canvas, put it up there, center it, set its value to 0 to begin with. Then on here, I'm going to create a flow script controller, create a new bound controller, or bound flow script. And then in here, what's really intuitive is I can say on variable change like this. Then I can grab my Text Mesh Pro and I can do set text, connect it up, and set it to the value of what this is, which is currently not connected, but I simply click this, global Blackboard, score, and there it is. Very straightforward. And you'll see now when I play, it increments there very nicely, and they're all kind of linked up. That's very nice. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you is how dynamic variables work. So we can create a dynamic variable by creating a variable node. So let's do a new graph variable, make it an integer. And now what we can do is click this, select dynamic variable, and call it my dynamic var. Now, what's important to note is that it has to start with an underscore. If I remove the underscore, it now is saying it's a missing variable, and it's looking for this, right? And by pressing that plus, it will add it to the graph. So let's make it back to a dynamic variable. You see here, it's a dynamic variable, type of integer. So the way that dynamic variables work is that they don't exist in the graph until they have been set. So let's set this. So set of type integer. And you see here, target variable. This is going to be our dynamic variable. We're going to call it the same name, my dynamic var. And we're going to set it to be 5. Okay, and now let's hook that up. So let's just grab this and let's change it to return. So when I press return, I'm going to set the dynamic variable to 5. And let's see what happens. So you see, it actually gets added here to our graph Blackboard variables. And so the main use case that I find for dynamic variables is when you don't want your Blackboard variables to be filled with a lot of irrelevant data. You don't want them to show all the variables. This may only be relevant in certain cases. And so you can use this. It's not as safe or as linked together as a normal graph variable, but there can be cases where this is useful. One other thing to bear in mind is that this dynamic variable is also a dynamic type. So let's change the generic type here. So let's copy that name. Okay, there we go. So the first one that is set will become what that type is. Let's change it to a more obvious thing. So let's say a color. Okay. So if I set it to a color first, then it will become a color variable on the graph. And if I try to set it to an integer, it will not allow me to do that. Let's have a look at that. Let's just give it a color at least, a red. Okay. So return for this one, and this one I'm going to use tab. And let's play and see what happens. So when I press return, it becomes a graph variable of type integer. And when I press tab, you see I actually get an error because the variable already exists. However, if I stop and play again, and this time I press tab first, so here tab, you see it sets it as the color, and now when I press when I press enter or return, I get the error. Now to access the dynamic variable, what we need to do, we can do the on variable change, dynamic var, write in the name like this. That works fine. Or also query it like this. Click that, dynamic var, and call that the same name, like that. So let's say when I press the backspace, I'm going to log the value of whatever this is. We don't know what the value is because it's dynamic. And on variable change, I will log the value as well. So now we do tab, then backspace, and there we go. Okay, so now there is another type of variable called an internal variable, which you can create by typing set internal variable. internal var. You give it an identifier, my internal. And the way this works is actually quite different to how all the other variables we've been working with have worked so far. For this one, it acts like a relay. And so whatever is inside here will be returned. Right now, it will return null. Okay, and now to get it, we actually just write the name like that, my internal. And you see it has this magic line, which we haven't seen before, that indicates that it is kind of special, right? So what this does is it redirects what the value of this is going to be to whatever this resolves to. What's important to understand is that although I can reference this as many times, and you see it's all referenced together, I cannot set it multiple times. You see, this is not actually connected to these at all, despite having the same identifier, whereas this is. So you can only have one of these per identifier. However, you can have as many of the reads as you want. So let's have a look at a little example. So let's create a greater than 10. So let's say speed greater than 10. And what we want to do is we want to return true if our speed is greater than 10 and false if our speed is less than 10. So let's change it to be a Boolean like that. Then we'll get our units per second, drag it out, greater than, so float greater than, create a constant, 10. Plug that in there. I'll create a keyboard key. When I press return, I'm going to log the value of the internal variable, which should be called speed is greater than 10. Search for speed is greater than 10. There it is. Let's play. So speed is not greater than 10. Let's change it to be 50. And now speed is greater than 10. Okay, so this can be a really nice way to shortcut resolving certain values. Rather than having to write this everywhere, we just have a nice shorthand internal var that can do it for us. Now you noticed that even though we didn't even call the set, this was resolved because of what I mentioned before. It works as a relay. It substitutes this value with the resolvement of this. It's very powerful. Now, if I want, I can call set. So let's say keyboard key. So when I press backspace, I'm going to set it. And you see, because I have actually set it to an explicit set, even though I updated my units per second, it's not actually updating that value. But if I press backspace, now it has updated this internal var, and I press enter, it now comes as true. And so you can use this to control that, to control it when you want it to actually recalculate, or you can not use this and just treat it as a nice relay. Basically, just a really nice way to organize your code so you can reuse this everywhere and have it always resolve in the same consistent manner. So one other cool thing you can do is you can actually have bound variables in your graphs. So a bound variable means that it, instead of being edited here, it's actually copied from a component or a static value. So for example, here, we're going to keep track of our local position here, or our position. And now this is always going to return what this is. Instead of having to drag this in and do, say, get position or whatever. Okay, this can just be a lot cleaner, a lot nicer. Same with, if I want to have pi, for example, looking through here, what have I got? Functions, reflected, mathf, fields, pi, right? So instead of that, I could just add a variable here, which is bound to mathf pi. And there we go. I don't need to keep searching through. So this can be a bit shorter, a bit easier to deal with rather than having to search through all the nodes. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that you can always unbind and you can always rebind. So let's say I actually wanted to bind it to the local position instead of the world position. There we go. So now it's that, and anywhere where this is used will be updated. So I don't have to go through and change everything again. So I hope that was useful. Hopefully you learned something about all the different types of variables, what they're good for, and how to utilize them in the most efficient and intuitive way possible.